And without further ado, we're going to turn the talk over to Andy. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for being, hi, it's good to see you guys. Yeah, I like seeing everybody wave, that's really nice. It's really good to be here with you guys today, and I just want to say, of course, thank you to Indie Design Week and also to Out in Tech, especially the Indie chapter, and Sean and Justin and Poppy for being really incredible stewards of this program. So thank you so much for having me here. I tried my best to like dress up for you today. I'm doing like a Beetlejuice as an ice cream man kind of thing going on. And let me see if I can actually share my screen. Great, can everyone see my PowerPoint? Okay, great. So I'm gonna talk, I'm gonna set a timer so that there is enough time for questions at the end. But I'm gonna talk today a little bit about my book, Queer by Design. As Sean said, it's been somewhat of a kind of embarrassing year for me in terms of kind of projects that have finally come out. And they've all come out right around the same time. So Queer by Design was released. We're coming up on the year anniversary of its release. So this is like such a great way for me to kind of mark that in particular. And then my academic book, or my tenure file book is Bound Together, which is based on my dissertation work, which is in and around leather communities in the United States and the kind of various visual and material cultures that they created. And then just recently, this past month, I co-edited and released a catalog with my colleague Amelia Jones, who's a performance arts scholar. And the catalog addresses the work of Ron Athey, who some of you may remember was embroiled in some of the NEA controversies around art and arts funding at the beginning of the 1990s. So if this talk is of interest to you at all, well, I've got good news for you. I have a bibliography now. So, so you can maybe read further if you want to. But really, what I want to chat with you today about is the kinds of things, objects, ideas that are contained within the Queer by Design book. And I'm showing you a smattering of objects here on the right, most of which I'll actually talk about in my talk with you today. So there'll be more, don't worry. But you know, the idea in the book was to take as broad a lens to design as I could. So the book is not simply a chronicle of those LGBTQ people who have been trained as designer and make a thing called capital D design, whatever that may be. It is really a history of coalitional struggle and political movement. And because it is about coalitional struggle and political movement, it really honors the capacities of individuals and communities to create, you know, graphics and ideas together in league with one another. So that means that I talk about buttons, I talk about t-shirt, I talk about posters, I talk about video games, I talk about internet systems, I talk about a lot of different kinds of design, all under this heading of LGBTQ or queer design. And I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of as we roll through some of the objects as well. But you may have noticed in the bottom corner that there's a graphic for Black Lives Matter. And this is important. And I think one of the things that I want to highlight about one of the things I really tried to do with the book was I tried to think about if we were to place a kind of history of LGBTQ design end to end, what kinds of narrative threads would be really interesting to kind of pick up on. What kinds of similarities and dissimilarities could we find between objects that are located across great kind of temporal distance, right? And one of the objects that I included in the book is this original logo design by the Design Action Collective, which is a collective of designers in Oakland, California, that was created in coordination with and for the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Lives Matter movement leaders. This is somewhat of a surprise for some people who only know the Black Lives Matter movement logo as the kind of textual component of what you see here, but obviously there's a representational half of this kind of logo as well. And that's a really specific kind of representation. What we see is a Black hooded youth holding a dandelion whose seeds are spreading to the wind, and like a phalanx of people behind him with their arms raised. And of course, Black Lives Matter was begun in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder. And so this is a moment to track back to a particular historical event, while also kind of intimating the ways in which tragedy in this case might actually unfurl something like social justice or social change, right? And when I decided to put Black Lives Matter in the book, it wasn't simply because it is exciting and a vibrant part of our kind of socio-political kind of landscape right now. It's also because 2 of the 3 founders of the movement identify as queer. And so from its very beginnings, Black Lives Matter was thought about as an intersectional gathering of people who were going to address not just kind of police brutality, but also a whole range of issues that are related to kind of authority and control and the policing of, in this case, particularly Black bodies. And, you know, one of the things that's really interesting in being a historian is you always kind of hear or feel these kind of echoes when you see new pieces of culture kind of coming up. And one of the things that I thought about as I was including Black Lives Matter in the book is I thought about these earlier pocket lawyers that were produced by the Society for Individual Rights in San Francisco. This is one of the earliest kind of political pieces of ephemera belonging to an overtly political LGBTQ group. It is a pocket lawyer, and it is meant to provide guidance in the eventuality, not the if, but the when you get arrested. It's worth reminding ourselves that homosexual sex itself, that is to say, certain forms of homosexual sex, sodomy in particular, were illegal in this country until 2003, right? So we are not yet even a generation beyond the point to which our sexual livelihoods have been kind of decriminalized. And even that, it might be argued, is still kind of up in the air. So the fight against police brutality and kind of authoritarian control has a much longer history in LGBTQ life and politics and history. And so one of the things that I hope to do with the book is to kind of show that, you know, from its inception, the LGBTQ movement wasn't necessarily about normative rights gaining. It wasn't necessarily about marriage. It wasn't necessarily about adoption. It wasn't necessarily about the army. What it was about was not being under threat of having everything taken away from you. And you have to remember that when queer people were arrested at this time, and this is prior to a gay liberation moment, or kind of a proto-gay liberation moment, everything would be taken away. Your name would be published in the paper, your address would be published in the paper. If someone came to your house and hurt you or killed you, it would be seen as just reward for the kind of lifestyle that you lived. So, you know, one of the things that resonates really strongly with me about Black Lives Matter and thinking about it as a key component of the story of Queer by Design is how these struggles actually continue on today, and how we are still fighting a set of similar battles on our own behalf and on the behalf of those who we care deeply about, right? So one of the kind of major through lines of the book was to kind of illuminate these moments where there might be, you know, particular kind of affinities between objects separated by like decades and decades of work. And I do that both with things that seem to be quite radical and things that maybe seem more normative, maybe like the HRC logo. You know, I treat that as I treat any other object in the book. In fact, there's a kind of essay devoted to this particular object. And what I was interested in here was how a nonprofit organization actually works in league with capital D designers, with people who are trained and are professionally designers, to create a new kind of logo for their nonprofit. And one of the things that I was able to find was the kind of proposal sheet, essentially, that Stone Yamashita drew up for the HRC. So you can really see this process of definition and redefinition happening, right? You see the logo that was eventually chosen. It's number 5 here, but there were all these other kind of possibilities. It's important to know that the HRC's logo prior to this point was a torch. So you see the first 4 examples kind of riffing off that idea of the torch held aloft. And then you get this kind of equal sign or equality kind of visual language. And then the kind of final set of designs is representational. It represents the faces of people who we might guess or hope are ostensibly LGBTQ, right? So I wanted to be as broad-minded to capture something like the HRC logo and to also capture the work of something like Community Press, which was an anarchist feminist print shop in New York. It was a pay what you wish model. People came in and developed posters and flyers and handbills that would be promoted around. And what you're looking at is a set of 2 posters, the first in English, the second in Spanish, that are made in response to the death of Harvey Milk, which is one of those momentous events in LGBTQ history. Harvey Milk was a San Francisco city supervisor. He was gunned down by a fellow supervisor, he and the mayor, actually. And there were riots in the aftermath of the acquittal of Harvey Milk's murder. And so this poster is a response to a kind of collective and community anger. Something that I find really fascinating about these posters is that they do a lot, you know, like there's this really beautiful poetic prose like text on the poster, but it's overlaid, or rather a labrys and a fist is overlaid on top of the text. And so the labrys is a symbol that has long been associated with lesbianism, and there's some actual historical archaeological evidence that that may be kind of true, you know, historically, that the labrys was a kind of axe or weapon, maybe even ceremonial thing that was held by female bands of warriors on the Scythian steppes. So there's this kind of really powerful double-headed axe symbol, and then an upraised fist, which it comes straight out of civil rights visual languages. And it's appropriated by lots of different groups, including LGBTQ political groups, right? So the idea is, you know, for me to both give a little bit of context to things that we see around us all the time, like the HRC bumper sticker on like the back of a car, and things that we may never have seen before, like these posters, which I think has only been published in one other place before. Or, for example, this poster, which to my knowledge has never been published anywhere else before outside of its original context. This is an AIDS education poster that was developed by a man named Robert Birch, who was an AIDS activist, and he was also a student and then a worker at Pierce College, which was a community college in California. And he made AIDS graphics under the name Cardiac Arrest. There are some really great posters that he's responsible for, but I was really interested in this more localized campaign, which was only meant for students of Pierce College. And it basically is a riff off of the game of life, right? Like you move through your childhood, through puberty swamp, through the teenage maze, on the road of life. And almost at every opportunity, there is a potential that you could become seropositive, that you could become HIV positive. And so this is a really grim, and I think a really beautiful object in that it speaks to the kind of heightened awareness, especially those who lived within the LGBTQ community had of the pandemic. And of course, I'm talking about the continuing and ongoing AIDS pandemic here, not the one that we're currently on lockdown for. So part of my thinking with the book was to also introduce audiences to entirely new or novel objects from the history of LGBTQ design. And I think, you know, I've come up with a pretty good mix of like the well-known and the unknown, but I'll let you kind of be the judge of that. So I want to kind of earnestly begin the exploration of the book proper with this object, which opens out my introductory essay in the book. It's a handmade poster. It reads, "Parents of gays unite in support of our children." And it has a little weird symbol at the bottom, which many of you may recognize as a lambda. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. It was made by a Queens school teacher by the name of Jeannie Manford. She made it because she was going to be marching alongside her son, Morty Manford, in the 1972 Christopher Street Liberation Day March, which is how one of the names of what we would now call a pride parade went by, right? Christopher Street is where the Stonewall Inn is. It's a liberation march, it's not a parade, right? But she made this sign and carried it alongside her son. And I wanted to start the book with this object because to me, it talks about the ambitions of the book in a very particular way. First of all, Jeannie Manford is a school teacher, so she's a communication expert, but she's not trained in design as such, right? And two, I wanted to kind of call in an allied readership, a readership who might not identify themselves as LGBTQ, but might have people that they love in their life who are LGBTQ, have intimate friends and people they care about who are LGBTQ. So I wanted to acknowledge that LGBTQ creation happens in a coalitional way, right? That the people who interface with our community and support our community are just as important to kind of think about, or as important to think about as those of us who are LGBTQ and are kind of supporting and producing within our communities. I also think it's just a really beautiful, I mean, this is where like sometimes when I'm in a classroom, people kind of roll their eyes at me, but like I also think it's also a really beautiful piece of design, because I think if you think about it in the context of a march, you probably don't have a lot of time to read the signs that people are carrying as they kind of march by you. And so Jeannie Manford did this really amazing thing, which is that she bolded 4 words, which actually speak to a more universalizing message. So if you just caught the poster for a split second, all you would read is "Parents Unite, Support Children." And that is like the heart of the message that Jeannie Manford kind of really wants to communicate, that it is a gay child, it is her gay child, is the specific and the reason that she is marching. You know, I don't think anybody would kind of debate that, but it's an appeal to other friends and family members. And actually this poster kicks off, is the instigation point of PFLAG, which is one of the longest running ally political groups that we know in the US devoted to LGBTQ friends and family. PFLAG stands for Parents and Friends and Family of Lesbians and Gays. And so it also is meant to speak to this way that from small acts of support, defiance, self-definition, can come really great and major things. The fact that this is the starting point for one of the most powerful nonprofit advocacy groups that we know of in the LGBTQ kind of array of advocacy groups is no small matter, right? And here's Jeannie Manford and here's Morty. Here they are marching, and you can see the sign in action actually in this photograph. So one of the things that I wanted to do is kind of signal that like from the start, this book is about how we make things together, how we change our lived conditions for the better, right? Just a little background on the lambda, that little funky tilde looking kind of thing that you see. That's one of the earliest and most ubiquitous signs of the gay liberation movement. And it's created by Tom Dorr of the Gay Activists Alliance. And he creates it by looking at a chemistry textbook. He realizes that lambda stands for the complete exchange of energy, which for him becomes a metaphorical idea of what activism and social change is all about. So the lambda is this appropriated symbol that then gets re-signified for this community. And that's a hallmark of LGBTQ design actually, is taking something that might have signaled in some other way and kind of coding it in a different way, and putting a different kind of meaning into it and beside it. PFLAG, like any group, kind of changes the way that it looks over the course of its lifetime. And currently, the group uses this kind of linked heart and triangle symbol. Just wanted to kind of catch you up on that, that they know that this is kind of their kind of logo way now. And I'm going to skip a couple slides because I want to really get into, oh, there's the final logo, the logo that they currently use. So you can see it with this kind of starburst behind it. But I also want to kind of talk about, I would be like remiss if I didn't talk about the rainbow pride flag. And because we're coming up on because we're coming up on Pride Month, and because everybody's kind of, even from home, people are kind of getting excited and kind of gearing up for that, wondering whether we're going to be able to kind of see one another in person or not, who knows. I think it's always good to give some extra context to maybe one of the most ubiquitous symbol of LGBTQ life that we currently live with, and that's the rainbow pride flag. The flag was created in 1978, so you have to do a little bit of math, but there was a whole, almost nearly a decade of LGBTQ rights struggle from Stonewall to the flag, where we didn't have the kind of rainbow pride flag. So there was all this kind of balkanization of the systems and signways of LGBTQ movements at that time. The rainbow flag became the national, and now I think the international, signal for LGBTQ solidarity. A lot of people are surprised when I show this photograph of the first, that you're seeing here, one of the two original rainbow pride flags that flew in 1978 for the Gay Freedom Day parade in San Francisco. And a lot of people are surprised because they don't expect to see the blue canton on the hoist, that part of the flag that looks like the American flag with all the stars in these kind of circles. It's a little different from the American flag because the stars are like in these, arranged in these circles instead of as a kind of even field. And people are also surprised at the scale of these things. These are 30 by 60 feet, and they no longer exist to the best of our knowledge. They are completely hand dyed, so you have to kind of do a little bit of math on that too, but the square footage of fabric that needed to be hand dyed and hand sewn together is quite enormous. And its meaning was really promiscuous and really kind of a lot of the kind of tangential meanings of the flag have kind of gotten lost along the way. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of background on the rainbow flag and kind of its history and its making, but I'm also going to use it as a way of talking through the contents of the book. So I'm going to use the values of the original 8-color pride flag to kind of highlight different places, different objects that I talk about in the book. So here's the original 8 colorway with the kind of associated meanings of the flags. You know, flags are like this really symbolic realm of design where every little thing has a kind of specific, metaphorical, very weighted kind of meaning. And this flag is no different. Each stripe stands for a particular value that Gilbert Baker and his collaborators identified as primary to the LGBTQ experience and life. So there's sex, life, healing, sunlight, nature, magic, serenity, and spirit. One of the most important things to understand about this early flag is that it really comes from a particular context. So, and that it challenges some of our ideas about design. So up until this point, generally, the flag has been assigned sole authorship, and that is to Gilbert Baker, who is identified as the flag's progenitor and maker. But the more research that I do about the rainbow flag, the less sure I actually am of that. And this is something that's kind of shifted since the book, actually. As I've done more research about the rainbow pride flag, and you would be surprised to know that there is not yet an article or a book or a long comprehensive text that gives a full historical accounting of the rainbow pride flag. It's like kind of a shock. But you would be surprised, I think, to know about some of its kind of adjacent meanings. So Gilbert Baker made this flag in coordination with 2 key collaborators. One is a woman named Lynn Segerblom, who at the time went by Fairy Rainbow Argyle. She actually changed her name to Fairy Rainbow Argyle, and it's like the most 70s San Francisco-ish thing I think I've ever seen in my life is someone named Fairy Rainbow Argyle. But she was known colloquially as the tie-dye queen of San Francisco. So all of the dye work of the flag is really traceable to Lynn Segerblom's technical expertise and know-how. And then James McNamara is the person who's taking these photos, and he was actually a seamster. So he was one of the key collaborators that actually sewed the thing. So now as I talk about the flag, I talk about it as a problem in thinking about how we might queer design history, which is to say that we would acknowledge beyond a single authorship system, the work of collaborators and coalition building in the making of queer design, right? So one of the things that I want to do is kind of write a longer text about the flag that really kind of makes a lot of this clearer, including some of the context about why we see a particular brand of homonationalism show up in that first flag. 1976 was the bicentennial of the United States for some people. For other people, that history is a lot longer. But you know, it makes reference to these kind of early flags that were kind of celebrated a couple years before the making of the rainbow flag, like Betsy Ross's colonial flag, right? And in fact, some of the programs from Gay Freedom Day, Christopher Street marches from that year, 1976, go all out on the Americana. So part of the story of the Rainbow Pride flag is a story about American nationalism, actually. And that is also surprising to a lot of people, that it's so clearly tied to kind of national identity in this particular case. And I think it continues to be in the popular imagination in many ways. That kind of blue star field is kind of invisible now when we look at the Rainbow Pride flag, but it still kind of carries over in some meaningful ways. The other thing that I want to kind of just mention about the Rainbow Pride flag, so you know a little bit more about it as you kind of engage in your own Pride celebrations this year. It comes from looking into, I think you'll notice like there's a star in the middle of the turquoise stripe. And in the book, I call it an errant queer star, like a star that's kind of like either been forced out or found its way out from the field of stars. So it's this kind of like really beautiful kind of metaphor about breaking out of confines. I think it's a really kind of lovely gesture. On one side of the flag, it was silver lame, and on the other side of the flag, it was gold lame. And that fabric that was used in this particular star on the turquoise stripe, it came from the costume closet of the Angels of Light in San Francisco. Lynn Segerblom was a member and someone who worked on costumes for this radical avant-garde performance troupe in San Francisco at the time. The Angels of Light were an offshoot of the Cockettes, for those of you who know your kind of avant-garde kind of performance history in San Francisco. And they did these kind of full plays that were highly encrusted, highly costumed, highly affected, almost kind of ridiculous in the kind of theater of the ridiculous sense. But Lynn Segerblom kind of raided that costume closet to kind of make that star. So in some ways, the flag is connected to these kind of underground performance histories as well. Gilbert Baker himself made clothing out of similar kinds of materials, so gold lame pants. And he also made costumes for San Francisco performers such as Rainbow the Mime, who was someone who was performing at the time that the rainbow flag was made. So there's a lot more context, historical context, that we can give to the rainbow flag. Unfortunately, when we see the flag today, what we see is the 6-color rainbow flag. So within the first couple years of the flag's existence, it changed pretty radically. It lost its pink and its turquoise stripe, standing for sex and magic, respectively. And the reason that it lost those stripes is that as Gilbert Baker and his collaborators were scaling up production for their flags, they knew that they couldn't hand dye every flag that was made. So they went to a local flag manufacturer to get their flag made and discovered that there were no mass manufactured pink and turquoise fabrics that they could use in their flag. Now, whether that was just a product of not super deep looking or whether that was like the case full stop at the time is something else that we might want to talk about. But essentially Gilbert Baker said, forget it, like let's leave off the pink and let's leave off the turquoise, and the 6-color rainbow pride flag was born, almost out of pragmatism, right? In the intervening years and in the more recent history, there have been other changes proposed to the rainbow pride flag. Most notably has been the city of Philadelphia's addition of the brown and black stripe, which came on the heels of a spate of violent attacks on queer people of color in that city. And so one of the things that they did as a city to redress and to show visible support for queer POC communities is they put a brown and black stripe kind of on the rainbow pride flag, not intending it for it to be a kind of national kind of symbol, but actually to address pretty local concerns at that point, right? Although it quickly became something like a national, people kind of took it up nationally. And then the flag below is created by Daniel Quasar, and they included the brown and black stripe, as well as the light blue, light pink, and white stripes from the transgender pride flag, which was developed by Monica Helms in the early 2000s. And Daniel Quasar's take on the flag is really interesting to me in some ways, because they think of it as something that can be creatable and combinable. So they've released these kind of sticker packs since kind of creating the Progress Pride flag, where you can kind of add your own colorways onto the rainbow pride flag to not only show how you are in coalition with a broader LGBTQ community, but also kind of your own individual investments in aspects of that community. Right. So it's a way of kind of both saying I'm here for the group and I'm also here for my own kind of group. And both of those things can coexist kind of side by side. Right. So the final thing that I want to talk about with the Rainbow Pride flag is something that I think a lot of you, and looking at your bios that you submitted, you are probably already well aware of and doing really great work with kind of inside of your own kind of workplaces, which is this kind of unfortunate trend of companies and corporations simply using a kind of rainbow colorway on their logos during Pride Month. For some companies, and you may belong to one of these companies, that rainbow colorway really represents a deep investment on the company's part for broader LGBTQ communities and for employees. Things like employee resource groups are really great kind of in this particular way. But for other companies, and I hope that you don't work for one such company, but the rainbow colorway is a way of kind of joining a bandwagon, but without any real need or demand to actually change living, working, livelihood conditions for their LGBTQ community employees and their extended families, right? So this often gets called rainbow washing or rainbow capitalism, right? And it's something that we want to be really aware of, because as we acknowledge that the rainbow flag has a particular history, calls out to a broad swath, I think, of the LGBTQ community, we also want to make sure that it's not being kind of re-signified in a way that drains it of its meaning. In fact, when the publisher of my book wanted to put the rainbow flag on the cover of my book, my initial response was no because of this. Because I was actually really tired of kind of seeing rainbows everywhere come June, right? Like, and I didn't want my book to be one more thing in kind of a host of other things that were rainbow colored, right? But the more that I did research into the rainbow flag, the more I found out about it, the more interesting and radical, to be quite frank, it became, right? So I ended up thinking that the rainbow flag was the right choice for the cover. But, you know, one of the things that stopped me at first from being so excited about the rainbow pride flag on the cover of the book was precisely this, was the way in which, in my kind of view, it's been co-opted by some companies and corporations to kind of falsely give a sense of like coalition building with LGBTQ communities, right? I'll give you like a brief example of what I mean by that, because for some people, that's kind of that's maybe like a kind of inflammatory thing to say. I'm from Austin. I was born and raised in Austin, Texas. And one of the last Pride parades that I remember in Austin featured a contingent from Apple, who also, you know, they have a rainbow colorway actually in their history, but they bring out the rainbow as part of kind of their Pride Month celebrations. And they have a CEO who's queer. I mean, all of these things are true about Apple. In the parade, they boasted the largest contingent in the parade, and their contingent took up about 2 blocks of the parade. When you put that next to the host of LGBTQ organizations that work at the individual and community level, churches, nonprofit groups, groups that support helplines, support homeless youth, like all of these things, you know, their physical presence at the Pride Parade could come nowhere near matching Apple's presence. Now, I think Apple does a lot of really important things, but in the context of a Pride Parade, for example, it might be a little overkill to have 2 blocks worth of employees marching with Apple gear and to be followed up by a church group, for example, who has really been working, I think, very hard within their own communities to kind of affect change at the ground level. So that's what I mean by like, you know, we want to be careful about the way that we kind of represent ourselves and are in league with the places that we work with when we represent ourselves. And by the way, I include myself in that category, as USC also does this sometimes too. Part of our jobs is to ask critical questions of those in charge of those companies or the places that we work to make sure that there's a full suite of policies that address the livelihoods of LGBTQ people, right? So for the rest of my like maybe 15 minutes with you, I'm gonna take the rainbow flag colorway and I'm just gonna highlight an object or two for each category. And these are just going to be like little quick shots, essentially. And if you want more, obviously, please read the book and let me know what you think. So I'll start with sexuality. I actually chose this partially because one of the makers of this recently died, Phyllis Lyon, who was one half of this really important couple, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, who founded a group called Daughters of Bilitis. My Texan twang wants to say Daughters of Bilitis, like really, really bad. So every time I have to make sure that I pronounce it correctly. But essentially, they were two women who founded a social and somewhat political group for other lesbians. And they produced what is one of the first lesbian publications, a publication called The Ladder. And this, what you're seeing here is a cover in its verso of one of the issues of The Ladder. And I love this cover because I find it incredibly hot, even as a gay man. Because what you have is you have this kind of butchy woman on one side and she's lowering her sunglasses and checking out this more femme appearing woman on the other side who is also lowering her sunglasses and checking out the other person. So it's this scene of lesbian cruising, which, you know, is fairly rare actually within the history of LGBTQ graphics to see an overt scene of kind of lesbian cruising. Oftentimes you see gay male cruising, but not lesbian cruising. Anyway, the more femme-looking woman is thinking this symbol, which is this triangle with two exclamation points and the text qui vive, which is French for on alert. And this was the earliest symbol that the Daughters of Bilitis used to identify other like members. So it was a kind of secret code in a way to acknowledge that you were part of our club, that you were okay to talk about certain things too. And I'm going to show you an image of both Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon much later on. Here they are holding one of the first copies of The Ladder. And you can see that the ladder kind of gets its name. It's a literal ladder. And they were thinking about it in relation to Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness, which was an early modernist novel about gender variance and lesbian desire in some ways. And they thought of their magazine as offering a ladder out of the well of loneliness, right? So that this was a way for people to kind of come into the light. When we think about what lesbian representation was at that particular time, we would need to look no further than pulp novels, which were a very popular genre, both amongst men and women, particularly younger women, both for a kind of lesbian titillation, but also because they were seen as warning texts for young women. These often told narratives of women who would be seduced and changed by an older, often more butch presenting woman. And they would often end in death, suicide, or the primary characters ending up in an asylum or a mental hospital. Very few of these novels ever broke out into the mainstream. One that did was the book on the left, The Price of Salt, which many of you may know now as Carol. There was a kind of a movie that was directed by Todd Haynes based on this book by Patricia Highsmith. And you'll also notice that Patricia Highsmith didn't use her name in this book. She used a pseudonym. A lot of LGBTQ writers did this because, again, it was quite dangerous to be an LGBTQ person at this time. In fact, the lesbian publisher Allison Books wanted to re-release The Price of Salt with Patricia Highsmith's name attached to it because they thought it was important for this, at that point, well-regarded writer to come out about the fact that she had kind of written this text. And they offered Patricia Highsmith one price if she came out under her name and another price if she kept her pseudonym. And she chose to keep her pseudonym for the book too. So that history is a kind of long and kind of really wide and complicated history, right? Life, red. So my choice for the life stripe might be a little counterintuitive, but it is this graphic, which was developed by the Silence Equals Death Project in the years immediately following the beginning of the AIDS global pandemic. This is a product of people who were a group of men who were both artists and comprised of artists and designers. And they took the symbol of the pink triangle, which was actually used by the Nazis in World War II to identify homosexual men. Homosexual women were given a black triangle along with political dissidents, and there's another, people who had sex with Jews also had the black triangle as well. But what they did essentially was re-signify this kind of symbol of hate and oppression to stand for political empowerment, right? With the text, silence equals death below it, right? At this point, in 1987, the then President Reagan had only just mentioned AIDS on national television. And to put a context around that, think about like every time that there's like an E. coli outbreak on some piece of lettuce that everybody in the nation hears about it within 24 hours, versus at the time that President Reagan spoke the word AIDS, over 3,600 people had died already over a period of years, right? So one of the things that this poster's after is to try to interrupt the kind of silence that they were experiencing on so many kind of systemic levels. It became, in many ways, the symbol of AIDS activism. And in fact, Gilbert Baker even kind of took this idea and re-signified it back to its Nazi origins during the year that Donald Trump got elected. So in the Women's March, he actually rolled around with this kind of cart of concentration camp uniforms as a kind of political protest, right? As a way of kind of saying like, we're in for a lot, that we're in for some seriously kind of dark times, right? So taking something like a symbol of death and re-signifying it to kind of instigate people to work on behalf of people so that they can live and be seen as human is, I think, one of the best expressions of kind of life in the book, at least in my thinking. Healing. Also related to the AIDS pandemic, this is one of my favorite objects from the book, and this is a video game that was developed by a woman named C.M. Ralph, who was moving from Orange County, which was super conservative and Republican at the time, still kind of is, it's changing, but still kind of is. And she was moving to San Francisco, and she was really excited because she was like, I'm moving to gay Mecca, essentially. And when she got there, she was totally despondent with what she found, which was a community that was in the midst of mourning and grieving those who were really affected by the pandemic. And so what she did in her despondency and in her despair and in her depression, to be quite frank about it, is she created a video game. She took a databasing software and used it to make the first, what we think of as the first ever queer video game. It is a detective procedural called Caper and the Castro, and you play as the lesbian detective Tracker McDyke, and you are trying to solve the kidnapping of a famous drag queen called Tessie LaFemme, and you are being blocked by a conservative lawmaker named Dulligan Straightman and Landon LaDouche, and it's this kind of really amazing way of thinking through LGBTQ urban politics. And in fact, I would encourage you to go out and find this. This is available on an emulator now. You can find it fairly easily if you search for Caper and the Castro. And it's I think it's a really kind of instructive play. But I love this as a response to pandemic because I think it addresses some of the issues of danger and despair, but through a kind of fictional lens, right? It uses fiction as one of many tools and kind of addressing power imbalance. Sunlight. So this is a little it's a little tangential, but I'm showing you this button that's supposed to be in the shape, I mean, it's a button shape, but it's in the shape of an orange too. And it calls out an orange. It is a button that was made to campaign against Anita Bryant, who at the time was campaigning for lots of things, but the most famous thing that she was kind of campaigning for was the dismissal of all LGBTQ teachers in grade school, because she and many other people at the time believed that there was a inseparable link between LGBTQ identity and pedophilia. And so the LGBTQ community came out in force against this because it was really their livelihoods that were on the line in so many ways. And to shut up teachers is to kind of shut up a kind of really profound light on humanity, because we often think of our teachers as mentors and people that we might aspire to be. And so if there are no LGBTQ people that are teaching, then LGBTQ youth really have no one to look up to kind of at that point. So, you know, she was a beauty queen, a singer, and a spokesperson for Florida Orange Juice. So a lot of the protests that happened around Anita Bryant's campaign incorporated kind of oranges, Florida orange juice cans in kind of various ways. So there's a lot of really kind of great LGBTQ ephemera from the mid-70s that has to do with oranges. And it's because of this campaign to fight against kind of the Briggs Initiative and Anita Bryant. And you can actually see one really powerful political protest here, where Anita Bryant's picture joins Stalin, Hitler, Idi Amin, and the KKK, right? And that she is kind of thought of on kind of equal footing as them. Nature. For this, I'm going to show you another magazine. This is RFD, which went by various names. The acronym could be spun out to be whatever you wanted it to be, but at least at first it was thought of as Radical Fairy Digest. And it was dedicated to a group of men mostly who were living out in the country and who were kind of separating themselves kind of off from urban communities. In fact, it joins a list of publications, really kind of profound and great publications that LGBTQ people have created. The cover is really great because it's a field of pansies, right? And of course, pansy is one of those words that gets used in a denigrating way to identify specifically kind of more effeminate men, right? Magic. So when I was assembling the book, my editor said you have to include Keith Haring, and I totally agreed. And they made a pitch for including Keith Haring's logo for the Heritage of Pride, which is New York City's Pride organization, which is what you see on the left. And I said, I'm only going to talk about that if I can also talk about the mural that he made in the bathroom of the what was then the Gay Men's Center, but now is the LGBT Center in New York City. And they totally said fine by that, because to me, this reveals a kind of tension within the book, which is how out and how pitched is the message towards a broad-based community or towards a kind of more smaller in-group community. And on one hand, you have a pretty inoffensive and very exciting and very dynamic drawing for the Pride organization. And on the other hand, you have a more graphic and also pretty exciting kind of mural for people who are accessing services at a community level. A mural that actually paid attention to their sexual livelihoods and lifeways and actually reflected some of that back to them and some of the anxieties that they may be having about that as well. So it performs a kind of bit of community work as well, right? So to me, that's a kind of, I know it might be a stretch, but that's a kind of magic to me, that someone can really be as thoughtful as Keith Haring was to know that this is the message that this group needs, this is the message that this group might need, right? And that he was able to kind of split his production in some really kind of profound ways. Two more colors. The first is Serenity. And I'm showing you here a couple of posters that were designed by Demian Dinayasha. Demian is a Dine artist. Dine it's also what gets known as Navajo. But Damien's work mashes up kind of indigenous signifiers with pop culture queer signifiers. So on the poster to the left, which says "There's no place like Kosho," You've got the line from The Wizard of Oz, that very famous line that Dorothy Gale speaks, mixed in with the Dine concept of Hosho, which means a kind of general well-being in all aspects of life, right? So, and it's combined with kind of indigenous building too, right? So there's a kind of argument that's being made that like, actually it's by our own kind of community standards that we kind of gain a sense of home. The poster on the right reproduces a quote from the band Coco Rosie. They've got angelic tendencies, like some boys tend to act like queens. And the figure in the middle is Wewa, who is a Zuni, public figure essentially, and was a person who we might now know as Two-Spirit, someone who both kind of lived male and female kind of roles. And she was actually sent in a delegation to meet the sitting president at that time, I think it was Grover Cleveland, and to kind of share some Zuni craft ways, right? So she's a really important figure who often doesn't get included in kind of histories of LGBTQ life in the United States. And then finally, Spirit. I'm going to end my talk with you, and then I'm hoping that we can have some questions back and forth too, with this. And I know I've talked a lot about the symbols that we may see in our everyday life and the ubiquitous symbols, the symbols that kind of have lasted throughout decades. But I kind of want to remind everybody in this room that, production often happens at the scale of the local. And in the early years of gay liberation, there were all of these signs that people were created and symbols that people were creating that today have just kind of fallen by the wayside. This is one of them, and it's one of the most fascinating ones in my opinion. It was created by Daniel Thaxton and Bernie Toll in Boston, and they developed the symbol of the lavender rhinoceros. And their thinking is that rhinoceri are like gentle creatures until you piss them off, at which point be prepared to be run down, right? Like, and that was their kind of way of thinking about what happens to an LGBTQ community when certain kinds of oppressions and restrictions are kind of placed on them, is that there's going to be a legitimate and good faith effort to fight back, right? So this gets lost, and instead of, it gets kind of subsumed under the rainbow pride flag. Like, again, the rainbow pride flag becomes the symbol that everybody kind of agrees on in some ways to stand in for LGBTQ rights and livelihoods. But in doing so, a lot of other kind of earlier symbols get kind of not buried precisely, but they're simply not as visible as we would have normally seen them. So part of the point of the book is to bring things up like this and to say, like, could we still maybe use this as a symbol? Could we still think about the rhinoceros as a kind of metaphor for our political power, right? So I want to kind of leave there and kind of just leave with the idea that, like, if we look back to the past, we can actually find tools for organizing in the present and in the future. And that one of the things I hope this book does is to give a kind of broad-based view of that history, and in so doing, give LGBTQ designers who are living and working now some additional tools to kind of work on behalf of our communities and our livelihoods. So thank you so much for hearing me out and for spending a little bit of time with me. And I really look forward to your questions, any question that you may have.
Thank you, Andy. That was amazing. Awesome. I see Simone has a question. Simone, do you want to unmute your mic and ask Andy?
Sure. Hi, Andy. Thank you
Simone.
so much for walking us through this. This is fascinating. I'm particularly interested in the history of the reclamation of derogatory iconography and language that we see in plenty of groups. I'm wondering, are there any icons that you think are ripe for reclamation today that you see in this political environment?
Yeah, I have seen I've seen some really interesting things that have been done with. First of all, thank you for that question. That's a really kind of great question, and you're right to point out that It's not just LGBTQ communities who do this, but all kinds of marginalized communities that take symbols of oppression and re-signify them, even language that might be associated with oppression, right? So people reclaiming words like faggot and dyke, and even at some point, gay was one of those words, although we think of it as a pretty neutral term now. I have seen in the past couple of years, a couple of kind of interesting moments of people referencing or using signs that were created by the Westboro Baptist Church, which is the church, Fred Phelps's church, that was famous for not only picketing LGBTQ events, but also picketing soldiers' funerals, because they thought that soldiers' deaths were just reward for the United States taking such a lax stance on homosexuality. I mean, it's a really kind of twisted form of, and it's really a kind of fucked up thinking, but that's what their idea, their central thesis was, or Fred Phelps's central thesis was. So I've seen fashion designers incorporate those signs into like kind of festival garments, like things that performers would wear. I think it was, the Scissor Sisters or something that wore, or Jake Shears, someone wore a garment that was kind of similar to that. And I actually have a tote bag that says "God hates bags." That was from kind of, it's a takeoff of that as well. I bring that up partially because in the book too, in the introduction, I actually tell a story of my cousin's funeral actually being picketed by the Westboro Baptist Church. He was killed overseas in the early years of our wars over there, our continuing wars over there. And it was just really instructive to me, because as soon as I heard that they were going to be picketing, there was this like knot of dread in my stomach. And my family had no clue who they were. I mean, it was the first time that they had ever heard of the Westboro Baptist Church. But of course, as a gay kid, like they're like boogeyman number one in some ways, right? Yeah, I've seen some interesting kind of reclamations of that. And of course, with any reclamation, it's contentious when it first comes out, right? Like when the pink triangle started to be used, it was meant as a provocation and as a contention. You know, it wasn't an easy thing to use. So people kind of taking some of the most odious symbols of hate and murder and genocide and re-signifying them, that is one way of kind of expressing or getting to something like empowerment. Just one path, but it's a really pretty remarkable one. Did that answer your question, Simone?
Absolutely, yeah, and I'd love to see some of those examples from the Westboro Baptist Church artwork that you're referencing, because I'm curious myself.
Yeah, I've mostly seen it in the realm of fashion, I have to say. Like I haven't seen it, it's not wide ranging, it's not a big kind of movement that I've seen, but I've noticed some examples of it over the past couple of years.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And Andy, Chris made an interesting comment earlier on in the speech about when you're talking about the inclusion of the pride flag.
Yeah.
Its commercialization, and I thought his comment sort of centers around the lack or exclusion of the black and brown stripes, yes, or the trans colors. Did you want to say a little bit about your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm sorry, I'm going all the way back, but I have noticed people in my community get grouchy and grumpy about this. And while I understand why they might be grouchy and grumpy about it to some degree, it actually doesn't hold up for me. Part of the reason why I want to do more historical work about the rainbow flag is that people have all these ideas about it, which are just patently false. Like the idea that it never changed. It changed remarkably in the first couple of years of its life. It lost 2 of its colors in the first couple of years of its life. And so to propose adding colors to it, it doesn't feel like that big of a deal to me in some ways. And in fact, what I see people doing around the flag, which is what people always do around flags, is they think about the meanings and who is included and who is excluded. And these are designers who are actually trying to redress some of those exclusions, at least on the level of visibility. And to me, it's kind of like, I want more people in that party. Like, I want more people connecting to our symbols and moving them and changing them and thinking with them. If there is something that might be queer about queer design, it might be a restlessness with kind of having one symbol unchanging stand in for all of us, right? So I think, like, for me, where I come down on kind of some of the debates about the recent additions to the pride flag is I love them. I mean, just to be quite clear, like, I think they're really rad, and I think that they come from these really amazing kind of historical contexts and from these folks. And by the way, I kind of skipped over it, but you know, even in the middle of this history, there were kind of additions to the pride flag. So during, you know, the height of the AIDS pandemic, really before we had, you know, drugs that allowed us to be seropositive but undetectable, right? AIDS activists had proposed to add a black stripe to the rainbow pride flag. And the idea was that the black stripe was a stripe for mourning. And the idea was that once a cure was found for HIV, that all of these flags, the victory over AIDS flags, would be brought to a central location and ritually burned as a kind of catharsis of the crisis. And so I think, like, you can think about those symbols, flags, and all the symbols that I've talked about in lots of different dimensions, both affective dimension, meaning feeling dimension, and also political dimensions. And to me, you know, adding a brown and black stripe, adding a pink and light blue stripe, oh God, I kind of went all the way to the end, but you get what I'm saying. Adding those things, to me, it's more grist for the mill. It's more, there are more people who I think are called into that design than are excluded by it, and I'm happy to see it. When people make arguments about good and bad design, I actually stop listening, because what is usually left out. So one of the arguments that you'll see against the black and brown flag, as well as the progress flag, is that it's quote unquote bad design. That's a kind of language that I only hear modernist designers using, who are pretty kind of old school about what constitutes design. I think one of the things that we need to do is to foundationally question what might be considered quote good or quote bad design. There's a whole host of values that are implicit in that kind of difference that often remain at the level of the unspoken. So oftentimes what people are saying is that I don't like that, or I don't like the way that looks, or I'm being asked to consider something that is outside of my usual field of vision, and it doesn't sit well with me. And instead, the word that they use for that is bad design, right? So, you know, I tend to think that, like, more people that are invited to the party, the better the party is, actually. So that's my kind of take on that.
Awesome. Omar Alexis, I see you have a question. Did you want to unmute yourself and ask Andy?
Sure. Hi, Andy.
Hi.
Omar Alexis, but I go by Lex. So my question is kind of similar to the question that Simone had asked regarding the reclamation of iconography.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I found interesting is not only the reclamation of derogatory icons, but also sort of manneristic symbols, things like the limp wrist and things
Totally.
like power fist. So that's something I tried to do in my own design with the limp wrist specifically. What other manneristic symbols do you know of that have been reclaimed either by the queer community or other minority groups aside from the Black Power Fist, for example?
Yeah, what I love about your question is it's actually kind of about embodiment too. Like, it's about kind of representation in the way that we're represented, but it's also the way that we live our identities in our bodies. So whether that's through a kind of learned affectation or even natural affectation, natural in quotes affectation. Yeah, I mean, I think the limp wrist is a really great one. You've seen, I've seen some interest in going back to, this is not an embodied thing as you're asking about, but I've seen some interest in kind of going back to the color lavender in design schemes, like actually, which seems like a pretty like outre kind of color at this point. It seems like that was a color that was really important maybe a couple generations ago in LGBTQ life, but I've seen some really interesting poster designs that make use of lavender in some interesting ways. But I don't know, I mean, I kind of think, Lex, that like that's its own kind of category of kind of thinking about design, this kind of embodied form of kind of design in some ways, or representation. And so I actually don't have a good arsenal at the ready to kind of give you kind of various things that kind of people are picking up on. Maybe one place that I would go is to the Hanky Code, which you've seen a lot of designers get interested in. Again, the Hanky Code was a system of signaling sexual interest, mostly amongst gay men, but not exclusively amongst gay men. The idea was that if you were in a crowded bar, you could put a particularly colored hanky on the right or left side of your body, and you would be signaling kind of active or passive, both of those are in quotes, interest in whatever activity was coordinated with that color. So red stood for fisting, for example. Blue was for fucking, as it's normally, like penetrative sex, as it's normally just, understood. Yellow is for golden showers, right? So you've seen a whole host of designers and artists actually update the Hanky Code and propose new meanings for the Hanky Code. And so I think that might be one kind of embodied way of dealing with design on the level of the body that might join something like a limp wrist, maybe. Did that kind of get at what you were asking?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
I think Kyle also had a great question, if you want to unmute Kyle.
You can unmute yourself, Kyle.
Hi there. So I'm currently an art history student, and I'm particularly interested in design as well as more architectural design, but and interior design as well. But I'm getting ready to think about graduate school. So if you have any advice, I know this is very kind of just like vague question, but if you have any advice for like graduate school and like the steps to lead towards that, that'd be great.
I mean, graduate school for me, and maybe other people want to chime in here too who have been through it, graduate school is about finding your people. So it's not so much about the institution you attend as it is the people that you're going to be working really closely with. So you really want to be thoughtful and circumspect about kind of who potentially you would be kind of working with in a graduate school education. I would also be thinking about resources. So one of the reasons why I took the job at USC was because the One Archives, which is the world's largest LGBTQ archives, is literally right down the street from my office. So I have access to a kind of whole world of research that I really didn't have before. I made the choice to go to grad school to the University of Texas at Austin, and that was almost purely a financial choice for me. I had student loan debt at that time, and I didn't feel comfortable taking on more than what I had at that point, which was about $80,000 worth of debt. What ended up happening is I ended up meeting my people at UT. I ended up meeting not only kind of fellow grad students who I thought were really rad, but I found an advisor and someone who I could do the kind of work I wanted to do with under their tutelage. So when I said I wanted to work on leather communities, that person didn't bat an eye. They were like, yeah, do it. Like they were excited for me. They weren't like, well, that's not really art history. Like there was none of that talk between me and my direct advisor. So if you can find that relationship of a person who is kind of behind the project that you want to kind of do while you're in grad school, then I think that's kind of maybe the best advice that I could give. And obviously finances are a big part of it too. So I hope that wherever you go, they're going to pay for you because they should.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, of course.
I see one more question in the chat, and if anybody else has additional questions, feel free to post them there. But Vic Tang, would you like to ask Andy your question?
Yeah, hi Andy.
Hi.
I have a question about identifying pride with the rainbow flag. So yeah. I grew up in Mesquite, Texas, and before that I live in Lima, Peru. So yeah. More like, I guess, conservative places. So I always had a hard time identifying with the rainbow flag because I also felt like you put a target on my back. So
Yes.
I was wondering if you have experienced that, or if you know of other people that share that sentiment, or just any information
Yeah.
that you can provide on that.
Yeah, that the rainbow flag is a powerful symbol for many reasons. One reason why it's really powerful is that, you know, and I say this thing in the book where I say, like, even in a dark room, you can tell that it's a rainbow flag. Like, it's like, even in a really dim place, you know exactly what the colors are. It has a capacity to be a site of healing and growth and validation for people who might not be getting a lot of that in their immediate context. And for that, it is like absolutely one of the most important pieces of design that we have, not only in LGBTQ life and livelihood, but in the world writ large. I mean, like, that is a pretty incredible thing for that kind of piece of design to do, actually. But I also think that there's an artist who I want you to check out. He's actually from Guatemala. He's not from Peru, but he has been doing a lot of projects in various places in Latin America. And he's done this kind of like pan Latin American project, which is really kind of interesting. And he looks at pink and he looks at the rainbow flag. His name is Esvin Alarcon Lam. So his first name is Esvin. His last name is Lam. And he's been doing, and he's a Guatemalan artist, but his family actually has Chinese ancestry. So he's Guatemalan Chinese. And he's been doing these really interesting paintings where he takes the rainbow flag, and he also takes the indigenous flag, which is this kind of, it looks like a pixelated kind of rainbow flag on the diagonal. And he's been doing these really wonderful kind of mashups of those things, and like pink volcanoes that are spewing out magenta lava, and like all kinds of really kind of amazing things. So if you want to kind of be thinking about kind of identity, and specifically kind of Latin American identities, I think he's a really good starting point. He's obviously not the only artist working in that idiom, but he'll lead you to other artists who are kind of working in that same way.
Thank you.
And happy to hear from a fellow Texan. That's really nice. Yeah.
We have another, one last question I see.
Yeah.
It also comes from, it looks like a fellow Texan. So Tyler, would you like to ask?
Sure. So when you mentioned UT Austin, I'd immediately thought of getting the chance to see Ellsworth Kelly's Temple for Light, a Rainbow Chapel. I sat through the opening panel. It was 90 minutes with his partner after he had passed, but his partners, not once in the 90 minutes did they mention anything about a Rainbow Chapel, except with Ellsworth being a queer artist, having anything to do with queer identity, etc. I was curious if you were more familiar with the work or Ellsworth.
Yeah.
And any thoughts on that in general?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. So Ellsworth Kelly is of a generation of artists, and I would include artists like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, and artists like Agnes Martin and other folks, Georgia O'Keeffe even, right? Who, although they lived livelihoods that were deeply queer in many ways, they rarely let it come out and inflect the interpretation of their work. In fact, they worked sometimes very hard to make sure that that didn't happen. I think there's two ways to think about that. One is that there's a kind of continuing erasure of that kind of aspect of their identity. And I think that kind of gets at what you're asking, Tyler, which is like, can we acknowledge that the rainbow is a part of the light spectrum, but also has this very particularized meaning within kind of American politics, and that Ellsworth Kelly himself was gay might be germane to that discussion, or that at least acknowledgement of the fact. But I also think it's a way of, I mean, what you can see in that are the very real lived consequences and traumatic tailings of being a queer person at the time that they were queer people, which is that, as I said earlier, while there was a friendliness towards people who identified as gay or lesbian or homophiles really at that time within the art world, in the larger world, they would have been persona non grata if they had really made any aspect of their work really truly about kind of LGBTQ identity in some way. So I think it's also a moment to reflect like what those generational differences are amongst kind of our ancestors and ourselves, and to kind of think about how we might want to introduce some of that conversation in ways that both acknowledge the challenges that they lived with in their daily life, but also acknowledge that we live in maybe changed circumstances, and that we might be able to have a more nuanced kind of conversation around that. I mean, it bums me out to no end that like that is what you experienced with that. And all I can say to that is the answer to that is it's kind of like more speech. You know, it's like you want to kind of be the person who writes the thing that says, can't we also talk about this with this chapel? Couldn't it also be this kind of incredible LGBTQ affirming kind of space in some ways, right? Like, but that's just not the tenor of the conversation. Knowing some of the curators at the Blanton, which is where this thing is cited, I know that there were really, really particular things, at least in the opening weeks and months, that they could and could not say about it. So there were curators who really wanted to talk about a kind of enlarged expanse of this, but partly it's a family foundation issue, partly it's a partner issue too, that the partner might have been overzealously guarding kind of some of the meanings of the artist's work, right? So I think that just, hopefully that change is coming, and hopefully we'll see a change in the way that people think and talk about that. For those of you who haven't seen this is a standalone chapel that is broken up into the chromatic spectrum. So it's this really, I mean, I don't know what your experience, Tyler, was of it, but it's a really kind of gorgeous and like space, right? But yeah.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was super insightful, and I'll share a link to the chapel for anyone who wants.
Thanks, Tyler. Thank you.
Awesome. And it looks like we've got one more question here from Ryan. I believe it's Shade.
Sure.
Hi. Yeah. Ryan's actually my dad. I'm only 16. He works for SEP. So he told me about this because I'm queer and I'm very interested in art.
Yay! Okay.
So sorry, there's a callback. My question is not necessarily about art. It's just if you had any advice for being young and being queer in a place where that's not always the easiest possible thing to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, God, I really empathize with you. Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is just like, you're not alone, clearly. I mean, as everyone on this call demonstrates, you know, I think so many people are really invested in thinking about their identity and their professional lives at once together, and that those things don't have to be separate for you to live kind of a full and meaningful life. I mean, obviously, but I think it's also about, it sounds like you're lucky enough to have parents who at least are guiding you towards resources, which is great. But I think you want to kind of start investigating your own history. I mean, to be honest, I mean, one of the most important sites for me as a young gay person was the gay bookstore in Austin and the feminist bookstore in Austin, because those were places where I could ask the person at the counter, hey, what about this? You know, and they could kind of dive into the stacks with me and help me find good resources. And those people, that community of people, of booksellers, of kind of resource guardians, archivists, they are some of the most important people that we can kind of interface with to kind of get a sense of the long history that we belong in. And I find incredible comfort from the fact that there are millions before me, and hopefully there will be millions after me, because it means that I am supported in a network of people who may not be just like me, but are enough like me, you know? Yeah, so I would actually say, like, beyond finding your people, like people you can hang with, people that you can be yourself with, I think starting to look at history is like actually a pretty empowering thing. And of course I would say that because I'm a historian, but I think that that's a way of getting a much broader, like 30,000 foot view. And that can take you out of your house in a way that I think very few things can do. And so much of that, by the way, is digital. So for example, maybe this is the last thing I'll say, and I actually have like a faculty meeting to go to, believe it or not, after this. So I have to like sign off kind of soon. The One Archives, the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, which is in Los Angeles, they have so many things in their collection that are online. They have just digitized their entire poster collection of something like 4,600 posters or something. So like literally go down a rabbit hole, like really like dig into that. Even in quarantine, you can find a lot of really amazing stuff. So that's what I would recommend. And good luck, Ryan. Look forward to seeing what you do once you kind of strike out on your own.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yep.
And thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and Eddie, we don't have any more questions. So any last remarks you'd like to make, where we can purchase your book, where we can support you, follow you on social media?
Where fine books are sold. I guess I would prefer that you try to pick it up from an independent bookseller. There are a couple of book aggregators that do that, and they're pretty easy to find. You can keep up with me and my activities on my website, but also on my, I have selectively chosen Instagram for my social media presence, just because I'm a visual person and I like sharing kind of visual things. So you can find me there at andycampy.com or at andycampy. The website is andycampy.com. And thank you again for having me today. And I'm grateful that you exist in the sectors that you exist in. I'm grateful that you exist on all the levels of corporate hierarchy, as it sounds like you all do. That gives me great comfort, daily, really, to know that, we're everywhere. And that means that we can build some pretty great political power together too. So thank you so much for this.